Recording police is mostly legal, but that doesn't mean cops may not try to stop you. I believe having your own video is key to protecting yourself, and it's also critical to stopping police misconduct. But can you be arrested for just being too close to a police officer? What about if a cop thinks you're too close to him while you're recording him? I'm Jeff Hampton, former prosecutor turned people's lawyer, and I've seen literally thousands of police interactions, and I know how police officers try to get you to stop recording them and how they have a full bag of tricks that they use to make you believe you do not have this constitutional right. One of those tricks is state laws that try to limit how close you can get while filming police activity. In this video, I'm breaking down a new Louisiana law that tries to limit how close you can get to cops while recording. I'm also going to cover what the Constitution has to say about all of this and what you can do to protect yourself if cops try to limit your constitutional right to record police interactions. First up, Louisiana's strange new law. This new Louisiana law that went into effect in 2024 states that if you knowingly approach a police officer while he is actively engaged in his officer duties and he orders you to stay back, you could be committing a crime. Imagine you're walking down a sidewalk and you look over and you see police officers interacting with someone. You decide you're going to stop what you're doing, observe what's taking place, things start getting a little rowdy, and maybe you decide you're going to record the encounter. I mean, this is all within your rights, right? But then suddenly you look over and you notice the police officer sees you. He starts yelling at you, telling you to step back, step further back, and claims you're now within 25 feet of this interaction. Even if you're not within 25 feet, does this mean you could be going to jail? Under this new Louisiana law, very much so. Now, why do we need a stupid law like this? Well, proponents of the law, like Governor Jeff Landry, he believes it's necessary for the safety of law enforcement. The governor believes that if you create this buffer zone between the police and their duties and bystanders who are walking nearby, he says it'll keep cops safer, and he also says it will stop possible encounters from escalating out of control. But here is where things get a little complicated, because you should be very concerned about how this affects your constitutional rights, and more specifically, your First Amendment rights to both free speech and free press. In fact, the former governor, John Bel Edwards, had vetoed a bill just like this in Louisiana, saying that he believed it would chill free speech and that he said it was absolutely unnecessary. The former governor rightly said that every individual has a constitutional right to observe police officers in their official duties. Governor Edwards said, and I quote, "Observations of law enforcement, whether by witness to an incident with officers, individuals interacting with officers, or members of the press, are invaluable in promoting transparency." This transparency for you and I is critical in order to hold law enforcement accountable for their actions during citizen encounters. Now, I'm not trying to overreact here. This law does not outright ban your ability to record the police or observe the police during interactions. The problem is that police officers get to, within their discretion, exercise this 25-foot rule, which now can make it much more difficult for you to exercise your constitutional right to record the police. Think about how this could be abused. Let's imagine that a police officer does not want to be recorded. In theory, officers could then order everyone that they think is within 25 feet to push further back away from the criminal investigation. Now, the further they push you back, claiming you're still within 25 feet, now it makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to actually record the interaction. This law could be abused by officers who now do not want to be recorded, and they try to claim that everyone has to push so far back that now it's difficult to record them, and they could use other assist officers to shield what's actually going on. The other problem with this law is that it uses terms like knowingly and engaged in law enforcement duties. These terms are highly subjective and can easily be open to the police officer's interpretation. What if you're unaware that you're within 25 feet? What if the officer doesn't clearly communicate his order for you to get back? There's one thing that's for sure. These ambiguities will lead to unintended consequences, which usually means you end up having your rights infringed. So where does this leave us? Can you still record the police? Yes, absolutely you can. You have a First Amendment right to record police officers in public places. But if you live in Louisiana or Indiana or any other state that tries to layer this type of actual restriction upon you while you're doing this, you're going to have to be very careful how you actually record the police officers and be aware of the fact they may be using any excuse they can to arrest you in doing so. Okay, let's get down to the most important part here. How do we stand up for our rights to record police officers under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution? Here are the 5 tips you need to know to protect yourself from the police if they try to stop you from recording. Rule number 1, know your state laws. Always know your state laws and what limitations your state may be placing on you when recording police. A good example of this is Louisiana and Indiana. Both of these states have this 25-foot law that we talked about a minute ago, and you've got to be very careful. They didn't say that you can't actually record the police. But using these type of laws allows prosecutors and law enforcement to punish people with their discretion, claiming that you have somehow violated some ancillary law just because they don't want you to record them. But let's be crystal clear. The United States Constitution says that we all have a First Amendment right to record police in their official duties in a public place as long as we do not interfere with their work. But make no mistake, it happens all the time. Police officers don't like to be recorded. They start feeling nervous, and you can get ready. They are going to both harass you, they'll likely detain you, and a very good chance they will confiscate any phone or camera that you might have. If tensions mount and people start yelling at each other because of the recording, you can guarantee that officers will likely now arrest you for some catch-all misdemeanor provision. Maybe something like obstruction of justice, interference with public duties, or disorderly conduct. However, let's be perfectly clear. You can never be charged with illegally recording the police. Now, some people have asked me, now, Jeff, wait a minute. Some states say that, in fact, there's 11 of them, that say you have to have the consent of both parties in order to record a conversation. In fact, those 11 states are California, Delaware, Florida, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, Montana, Nevada, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and Washington. But here's the deal. Even though that law may apply to private interactions between people in those recordings, they have a provision that there is no expectation of privacy for police officers in a public place for you to be able to record them in their official duties. Rule number 2, be ready for how to respond to common things that cops will say. When it comes to police encounters, you don't get to choose the type of cop you're dealing with. You might end up running into officer friendly, or you might run into officer psycho. But when you choose to record police officers, get ready to think on your feet, because you can guarantee it, they're going to confront you. Now look, in most circumstances, cops are not just going to bull rush you for filming them. However, if there is a cop that's insecure and hasn't been properly trained, they might see it as a challenge to their authority, and they will get aggressive. Now, all too often, you might be dealing with a police officer who simply does not know the law. And you really have 2 choices here. Choice number 1 is to literally exercise your constitutional right. You can choose to be silent. You can say, officer, I exercise my right to remain silent. I will not answer any of your questions. Or choice number 2, you can choose to inform the officer about the law. Now, if you choose to inform them of the law, part of your task is going to be to convince them that you're no real threat to them while also standing your ground. So let's say the officer looks at you and says, what exactly do you think you're doing? Look, police are not celebrities, and they're not exactly used to people choosing to actually record them in public. So there's a good chance an officer might walk up to you while you're recording what's going on, and they may ask you, hey man, what exactly do you think you're doing? I would be very careful saying things like, I'm recording you to make sure you're doing your job right, or it's none of your business, I don't trust you. Instead, consider something like this. Officer, I'm not interfering. I'm asserting my First Amendment rights. You're being documented and recorded from a safe distance. Now, if you say those words while both being calm and collected in how you say it, you're going to put the police officer in a pretty tough situation to kind of force them to remain on their best behavior. Sometimes officers may follow up with this by saying, well, why are you recording? Who exactly do you work for? I can't stand it when police officers ask this question because it makes it seem like that First Amendment rights only apply to news agencies or photojournalists or something like that. But in reality, you might be an independent filmmaker. You might be someone who is choosing to collect this information and do something with it later. So you can answer them and say, I'm an independent photographer, and I'm here making a recording in order to be able to use this in the future. Don't let the police trick you into thinking that the First Amendment only applies to media or some mainstream journalists. It absolutely does not. It applies for each and every one of us. Now, what if the officer says, "All right, that's it. Let me see your ID." First of all, in the United States, there is no law in any state that requires anyone to carry an ID. But in at least 25 states, a good number of states, police may require you to provide proof of your identification if they have reasonable suspicion that you're involved in criminal activity. But how can you tell if a police officer asking for your ID actually has reasonable suspicion? Police need reasonable suspicion in order to detain you. So one way to determine and hear from the officer himself whether he thinks he has enough reasonable suspicion to hold you is to ask if you are free to go. You can literally do this by saying, "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" If the officer says that you're free to go or that you're not being detained, it's your choice now. You can choose to leave or you can continue to stand there and continue to record. But if you're detained, you might be able to say something like this: "Officer, I'm not required to show you my ID, but my name is," and then you can tell the officer what your name is. But always check your state laws, because some states have really cracked down on the requirement to provide some identification if an officer approaches you, and it's not really that difficult for cops to claim they have reasonable suspicion in order to justify that request. Okay, now here's the big one. What if cops come up to you directly and say, "Stop recording me, it's against the law"? Now, I know all the temptation here is going to be for you to educate this really hacked off police officer on the state of the law. Be very careful when you do this. But if you know you are absolutely in the right, you've done nothing wrong, you're not interfering with this police officer, you might be able to at least somewhat introduce the fact that you know you are standing up for your rights and reminding the officer that if he's going to move this encounter forward, he's about to make a critical mistake. For example, I've actually seen a cop tell somebody that was recording him one time saying, "Hey, you are violating my civil liberties." If an officer tries to tell you that, you might try to respond with something like this: "Officer, with all due respect, state law only requires permission from one party in a conversation. I don't need your permission to record so long as I am not interfering with your work." Now, what if a federal officer walks up to you because you're filming on federal property? You can calmly and collectively remind that federal officer that you have a constitutional right to be able to record police interactions even on federal property. Now, what if this starts to get a little bit more intense and the officer comes up closer to you and says, "Stand back"? If you're approaching the scene of an investigation or a possible accident, this is much more likely that the police officers are not going to be exactly conversational with you. They're going to start barking orders at you and telling you you must move back. In fact, this is exactly what happened to a bystander during Tyreek Hill's recent arrest. A man was standing nearby, and cops kept demanding that that man leave the scene, even though he was standing on a public sidewalk. This is where you must be aware of your state laws. Because if this had happened in Indiana or Louisiana, where this 25-foot rule kicks in, this is going to be all the officer needs when you don't do what he tells you to do. He can use that now as a basis to arrest you as a violation of that law. But even if that's not your state law, be careful, because if the officer continues to yell at you, you may have done nothing wrong. In fact, your case may later be thrown out, but I've seen officers claim that because you didn't do what you were told, you have now interfered with their public duties. Depending on the circumstances, get ready for a pretty intense negotiation with this police officer over what the appropriate distance needs to be so that you're not interfering with their work. Now, what if you feel that you're standing a reasonable distance away from everything that's taking place? If you want to know what to say, you could respond with something like this: "Officer, I have a right to be here. I'm filming for documentation purposes and I'm not interfering with your work." Then it's up to you how comfortable you feel with having to back up further if the cop continues to demand that you do so. Remember, it all comes down to whether you're going to take a stand in that certain situation, or it is very possible the officer will use this as a pretext for an arrest. Rule number 3, don't share your video with the police. Now, what if you come up on a situation and you happen to see police brutality or some type of police misconduct? If the police officer sees that you're recording this, there's a good chance they're going to aggressively seize your phone. So it's really important that you are prepared to send that recording to the cloud or that you're sending it to YouTube or to upload it to some particular platform so that you will be able to maintain custody of it. For example, about 10 years ago, a Massachusetts woman actually videotaped a police officer beating a man with a flashlight. She then uploaded it directly to YouTube. Afterward, when one of the cops saw that she had posted it to the internet, he then turned around and tried to get her charged with wiretapping charges. As usual, of course, those charges were later dropped, but notice what happened. The officer used it as a basis to end up arresting her. In another situation, an anonymous videographer actually uploaded a video of an NYPD officer slamming a bicyclist to the ground. He uploaded it directly to YouTube. Although the videographer was never discovered, the video actually went viral. And because of the courage of someone actually posting that video, the assault charges against the bicyclist, they actually tried to charge the bicyclist with assault. Those charges were dropped. The officer was ultimately fired, and there was some actual justice that took place as a result of the recording. In fact, the bicyclist ultimately ended up suing the city, and he at least got a $65,000 settlement. So if you're going to take the risk and stand up for your rights to record the incident, don't give over the video to the police. Rule number 4, if you keep recording, prepare to be arrested. This is particularly true in very high tense environments. Let's say there's somebody fighting back with a police officer, or maybe there's some potential misconduct going on here. You may be standing there exercising your First Amendment rights, but all of a sudden the officer could decide to turn in your direction, and if you continue to record them when they start barking orders at you, be prepared that the officer will use your willingness to continue to record as a basis to try to arrest you. In fact, what if the officer looks at you and says, "Shut it off now or I'm going to arrest you"? At this point, you have a choice. You either risk possible arrest or you're going to exercise your First Amendment rights of free speech. But whatever you choose, if the police officer tells you he's going to arrest you, believe them. I've seen some journalists, I've actually seen some people just standing out there recording that'll say, "Okay, officer, I'm turning this off here, but it's all under protest because I have a constitutional right to do this." And others will say, "Officer, I absolutely will not stop recording, and I'm going to continue to do so under my First Amendment rights." If that happens, brace yourself for a potential arrest because the officer will now claim you're interfering with his public duties. Now, if the officer starts coming after you to arrest you, do your very best not to drop the camera and try to keep it running, even if you have to set it aside so that people can actually hear the audio of what happened. But do not resist arrest. Remember, resisting arrest will give the officer all the excuse he needs to actually raise the level of tension. And now not only could you end up getting hurt, but he could try to claim additional charges against you because you resisted. And by the way, at this point, one of the best things you can do if he's chosen to arrest you is exercise your right to remain silent. Don't say anything else. If he's going to haul you away, exercise your right to remain silent and absolutely force them to have to prove and justify why they arrested you. Remember, there's a good chance that either your camera is still recording or the officer's body camera is still recording. So keep calm and act like you're being judged by a million of your peers on YouTube, because one day you might be. Rule number 5, master your phone and don't point your phone at the officer like a gun. I said this earlier, but if you're going to use your cell phone or a camera to record a police interaction, know exactly how to use it and where exactly to send the footage. Oh, and by the way, always password protect your smartphone. The reason why is police officers are very frequently using people's biometrics in order to unlock a phone, and they can get access to the original recording. In fact, I did a video recently where I laid out that many of the appellate courts have ruled that the use of biometrics, whether it's through a fingerprint or whether it's through a face recognition, does not violate your search rights because the courts are claiming it's actually not a search. So if the cops are trying to get you to reveal what your password is or your passcode, number 1, don't give them your passcode. And number 2, take off all the biometrics on your phone so that the officer can't just force your finger or your face in front of the phone. Now here's the number 1 reason why I find most people get arrested when they're filming the police. It's the posture that they use and where they put the phone relative to the police officer. If you take a very aggressive posture and if you start slamming that phone in the face of the police officer, get ready to be arrested for interference with public duties. Whatever you do, As you're recording the officer, keep the phone close to your body and never put it in the cop's face. By keeping the camera near you, you can actually keep eye contact with the police officer, and you can occasionally glance down to make sure that your camera is actually recording the full picture of what's going on. I know this posture might seem awkward at first. It might not be the natural thing you want to do, especially if you're frustrated. You might want to put that phone right in the officer's face. But if the officer is going to choose to arrest you, a reasonable person, and many jurors have found this to be the case, it is reasonable, and it's certainly not interfering with an officer when you keep the camera close to yourself, but yet you're recording everything. Also, if you are going to make sure and record an interaction with an officer, make sure you maintain control of that camera before the officer approaches. This is the number one mistake I see people make in traffic stops. If you want to actually record a traffic stop and you know the officer's going to come up, have your phone ready, already recording, push record, have it in place so that it can capture everything. Because if you wait to grab for your phone as the officer's coming up to your window, there's a good chance he's going to claim he thought you were grabbing for a weapon, and now this is going to raise the tension level, and you could end up either getting hurt in that interaction, or the officer will use it as a pretext and a justification under officer safety to get you out of your car, and now you're looking at a search and a possible arrest. If you were arrested for filming police officers and you know you were exercising your First Amendment constitutional right, and the officer is trying to make you the actual bad guy here and you know you were the hero, option number one is you can hire an attorney to advocate for you, to be able to go after that officer and the potential for getting your case dismissed because they violated your rights. The second option is if you don't have the resources to hire an attorney, that's exactly why the American Civil Liberties Union is in existence. And regardless of people's opinion on the ACLU, they will give you free advice and free direction on how to make sure your rights are protected if you were arrested or you're facing some type of civil damages because of what the cops did. But the next time you see the police in action, and maybe there's some chance that there's some improper activity going on, remember, your opportunity to play a role in our society to help make sure and tip the balance for justice could be as simple as the cell phone in your hand. Now, what if cops approach you while you're recording them and you can tell that they already have it out for you? So you choose instead to exercise your right to remain silent. Did you know that smart cops will try to use a Fifth Amendment loophole against you even if you keep your mouth closed? Check out this next video where I break down how cops trick you to get around your right to remain silent. See you over there.